All right, folks, glad to be back here with Democratic candidate for governor, Les Gara. We're going to sit down and talk about his campaign. He recently filed to run for governor. First, I want to thank our main sponsor, GCI, for making live streams like this possible. And again, Les, I'm happy you're here sitting down with me to talk about your campaign.
Oh, it's good to see you, Jeff.
You too. We saw you at Beartooth last week.
Yeah, I love the Beartooth, and I hate the fact that I can't go there as much as I want to. So.
Oh, with the COVID?
Yeah, I don't, right now, 1,000 cases today or 800. I can't.
Yes.
I lost track. My wife works at the hospital, and so I'm more sensitive about it, just because my wife comes home with the stories every day, and they're tough stories.
You were vaccinated, I imagine?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I got mine back in March, so.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about your campaign. You just recently announced you were the fourth person to get in the race after Governor Dunleavy, Bill Walker, and then there's Billy Toyen,
Yeah.
Libertarian. You know him? He's a
I don't know Billy.
bit of a character. We interviewed him once on a party bus. Very libertarian.
You're never going to interview me on a party bus.
We could do it.
No, we're not doing it. Yeah.
But you're the first. You're the fourth one in, and it happened very quickly. I mean, there was kind of one person, and then all of a sudden there was four.
Yeah.
And you're the first Democrat. So first question I want to ask you is, why have you? And you a few months ago talked about maybe getting in.
I thought about it for a long time, we'll talk later about ranked choice voting. Why now you have room for four candidates. The top four go to November, and if you have a bunch of bad candidates go to November, the bad person gets everybody's second place votes, and everything's out the window. But the why is this. The short of it is, Governor Dunleavy has done not just the things that hurt kids or seniors or rural Alaskans or people born without privilege, but even, let's say he wants to toss all those people aside. He's left the low-hanging fruit of 6,000 jobs you could put people to work at tomorrow. Until 2016, before we had the budget deficit, the state construction budget was about $500 million a year. That funded energy projects, it funded road construction, port construction. Look at the Anchorage port. I mean, it's an embarrassment.
Before that, it was $2 billion, much before that.
Sure. No, but of the state money, it was about $500 million of state money, and then we leveraged other money. And it was about 500. Now it's about $100 million. And according to the University of Alaska, the study at ICER, every $100 million you cut out of the construction budget costs you about 1,500 jobs. Construction workers, truck drivers, electricians, laborers, and then their money now doesn't spread around the community to restaurants, doesn't spread around the community to a hardware store, doesn't spread around the community to all of our local businesses. And the ultimate impact is, you cut $100 million out of the construction budget, you lose 1,500 jobs that you would otherwise have. We've cut $400 million out of the construction budget, and he's done nothing to build it back up. And not only, the wonky stuff aside, that's 6,000 jobs that people could be working at today. 6,000 good paying jobs. And when you get elected and the biggest issue facing you is the budget deficit and you've done nothing about it, you don't deserve to be governor. We're in a recession. He's set a record now for the number of years in a row. People are leaving the state of Alaska because they see no future here. And I want to build back the future. I mean, it's my background tells me that this is the right thing to do, given what I had to go through when I was a kid, and I got the help that I needed. Well, why are we not going to give people the chance at a good job, or if they want to go to college, the chance at a good university instead of one that's torn apart, or if they want to get job training, the biggest job training center in Alaska was the university. He's taken away opportunity for people to say, we've got a bright future. We don't have a bright future under him.
So on that note, I mean, the Finance Committee is meeting right now to talk about the dividend. There's no dividend right now. They're taking public testimony. They're talking about other oil tax credits, and it all kind of goes back to this deficit you're talking about. For several years, there's been a big deficit, and the savings are gone. There's still a deficit without new revenues, and especially depending on the size of the dividend, most of the savings are gone. There's the earnings reserve, which some people want to go into. To have these capital budgets like you're talking about, what's the path forward to do that? Because there's been talk about it you were in the legislature for many years on the Finance Committee.
Yeah, well, at some point you got to take your ideal fiscal plan and say, I don't get to run the legislature. I mean, I'm one vote. And so the Republicans wanted to cut the dividend. I didn't love that at all. Back then Pete Kelly wanted to make it $500, and frankly Kevin Meyer, who's lieutenant governor, wanted to make it $1,000. And I didn't really like that, but I thought you need a fiscal plan that actually asks the most privileged people to chip in too. So we've got oil fields that pay no production taxes at prices below $60 a barrel because of the tax credits we give them. We give them so much money in tax credits that they pay no production taxes below $60 a barrel for their first 7 years of production. I mean, people can talk as far as oil tax reform, but nobody talks about the specifics, and that's not fair to the public to not do that.
Well, I think it's one of those issues that even for me, and I follow this stuff real closely, it's hard. You got the per barrel credit, you have the royalty, the production tax, you have all these different, depending on the field, and it's really hard to wrap your kind of mind around it.
But it's easy to wrap your arms around the actual money because we get chump change now. We have the royalty we get is roughly half of the royalty that the lower 48 states charge. They either charge it, the state of Texas has a 25% royalty, we have a 12.5% royalty. We're chumps. Private landowners, and that's really the free market. And the lower 48, we own the oil here, so we get the royalty, or maybe on Alaska Native land, they get the royalty. But largely on most of the oil in Alaska, we get the royalty. It's 12.5%. In Texas, the state charges 25%, twice as much. And private landowners who get the royalty on private lands, sort of picture the Beverly Hillbillies, they own the oil in Texas. It's private ownership in a lot of places. They negotiate 25 and 30% royalties because they're savvy. We're not savvy. And sure, in a $20 million campaign, the oil industry can say, oh boy, Alaska's not competitive, but guess what? Conoco is the only company that has to, under the SEC rules, report their Alaska profits. The other ones will say, we're not telling you. So that's a useful conversation. The other ones come in and say, we need tax breaks, but we're not telling you how big our profits are. But we know what Conoco's are. And Conoco, in the 4 years preceding this year, because we don't have their annual report yet, the prior 4 years made $7 billion more in profit in Alaska than all of the lower 49 states combined. $7 billion more. They lost $2.5 billion in the lower 48 over those 4 years. They made over $5 billion in Alaska. And you tell me that we're the bad place to do business? We're the cash cow. They take their profits from here, and under our law says you don't have to invest any money in Alaska. You can take all that money out of Alaska, and we'll still give you tax credits.
What would you say though about historically? What there was now there's this new structure. I guess it's the More Production Act. There was ACES, there was ELF, there was PP.
Less Production Act, because we have less production.
That's 1 million barrels.
Right, Dan Sullivan and all those guys said, we'll have 1 million barrels a day when you pass this, and production has gone down, because it does nothing to incentivize production. It tells you get these corporate tax subsidies whether or not you invest in Alaska. I mean, that's a great deal. So, I mean, if you tell an oil company like Exxon, hey, you get this tax credits, and you get just as much money if you invest the money in Texas. They're like, thanks.
So you've talked about this a lot when you were in the legislature and right now, and then Senator Wilkowski was in here a few weeks ago. We were talking, and this comes up, and there are people who talk about this, but it doesn't ever seem to get much traction in the legislature, except every 5 or 10 years when there's some big change.
Sure. And so, what are your alternatives? That you tell the people in the Matsu Valley and in Kodiak and in Nome that on top of your local sales tax, we're going to add a 3, 4, 5% state sales tax. And the numbers the state's talking about, that Dunleavy's talking about, are fake, because he talks about 2, 3% sales tax with no exemptions for groceries. So under his bill, you would tax a doctor's visit. So your doctor's visit, sales tax. Homeowner's insurance, put sales tax on it. Buy a house, sales tax on it. Buy a $30,000 car, sales tax on it. Are you serious? So once you start going through the exemptions that everybody's going to want and say, wait, I shouldn't have a tax on my doctor's visit. That's crazy. Once you start adding in the exemptions, and then the oil industry comes in and says, hey, we're bringing up $1 billion worth of equipment this year. You can't tax that.
So the amount of tax revenue, whether it's income or sales or oil or industry, whatever, would be dependent really on the amount of the dividend. Because if there was no, and I'm not saying there should be no dividend, but if there was no dividend, there'd be a bit of a surplus right now. If there was a huge dividend, there'd be a big deficit. So, what's the solution on the dividend, which is still not, hasn't been resolved.
Well, the solution is to have revenue so you don't make fake promises that you're going to pay it, right? I mean, the criticism of liberals back in the 70s, 80s was they wanted to spend, but they had no money to pay for what they wanted to spend. And what the governor's done is convince people that he believes in a dividend that I don't believe he believes in. Because if you believed in it, you would propose the dividend and then propose a way to pay for it. He's just proposed the spending part and never proposed the way to pay for it part, except for this year when he says, hey, let's take $3 billion extra to pay for government, and that'll tide us over.
He did back off from the statutory. Now he's at the 50-50. So
he is at what would be a $4,000 dividend. Now he's at a $2,300 dividend. I mean, what do you believe in? I mean, if you really believed in the dividend, you would fund it. And so after 3 years of not proposing a way to fund it, and now that he's facing re-election, and he doesn't want to admit that inside his own budget he had $1.2 billion worth of personal taxes, but he wouldn't tell you what they were going to be. He just put in, we need $1.2 billion of taxes to balance his budget, and that's in his budget, in his February budget, and he likes to not talk about that, and he still hasn't identified what those $1.2 billion of taxes were. If you don't propose a way to pay for the permanent fund dividend, the promise is fake, and that's why it was $900 last year. A $900 dividend because he offered no way to pay for it. This year, he's like, well, why don't we spend $6 billion from the permanent fund? $3 billion to fund stuff and the dividend, and then $3 billion more so we can pay for government the next couple of years. So he's the first governor in state history to raid the permanent fund. $6 billion from the permanent fund. It's supposed to grow so it produces more income, so we can all live on it and have schools, and so we can have a good dividend. And if you take $6 billion out of the permanent fund, it produces that much less income.
The legislature, obviously, you were there a long time, and you were in the finance committee, and you're mostly in the minority. You were in the majority the last 2 years. This is also on them, and there's this whole issue of funding it, and they appropriate, and there was the lawsuit. So I want to ask you, if you were to be governor, you were in the legislature, you were in the majority for a bit. What's the disconnect, and how would you work with the legislature? Right now we see the governor, and even Governor Walker before had a lot of problems with the legislature.
Well, look, I passed a fiscal plan. I mean, if the fiscal plan that I voted for that passed the House with 21 votes, 21 people were brave enough to vote for pieces that they really didn't agree with, but they knew that we had a bigger deficit in 2017 than we do today because oil was $30 a barrel. Right, at $60 a barrel, it's $1 billion, $2 billion. Mm-hmm. At $30 a barrel, we were on some scenarios it was $3 billion, and you could spend all your savings, and that's what people ended up doing. We had $17 billion of savings. We were in good shape in 2014, and the plan has been for Dunleavy when he was state senator, and now that he's been governor, just spend all our savings, and now spend the permanent fund, $6 billion.
Well, to be fair, it's not just. I mean, a lot of people voted for that spending.
I don't care. I'm running against Mike Dunleavy. I'm not running against John Coghill. I'm not running against Pete Kelly. I'm running against Mike Dunleavy. Mike Dunleavy has spent all of our savings and won't stand up to the oil industry to say, hey, if you chip in, we might actually have a future in the state. We don't have to give you the lowest taxes of any major oil producing state in the country. We don't have to have a chump change royalty when the state of Texas charges 25% on state lands in Texas. And that's an oil company dominated state. That's not a liberal state. They're taking 25%. A 25% royalty, we take half of that. That is an extra $500 million to $1 billion if we just had the Texas royalty. And so then the argument is, oh, but Texas is more profitable. No, Texas is not more profitable. If you look at Conoco's reports, they lost $2.5 billion in the lower 48 those prior 4 years and made over $5 billion here. And it is just, it's crocodile tears. So look, I believe in the oil industry. I vote to open INWAR, right? I've done that. I wrote a letter to the Obama administration saying Conoco has a very promising CD5 field in the National Petroleum Reserve, and you won't let them build a bridge that they need to build over the Colville River to access that oil. And there's no logical reason. Well, we just saw the judge rule on Willow. That's been another big prospect.
I get that, but it's just, I believe in oil development, and I believe that in the jobs that it brings. I just don't believe that we have to give away our oil as if the oil companies own us. I believe in being partners with the oil industry, but I will not be junior partners. And the oil belongs to the state of Alaska, and if Exxon owned this oil, do you think they would sell it at the price that we sell it at? We should be selling it at the price that a savvy company would be selling it at, but we're selling it as if we're chumps. And all right, if you want to be a chump, be a chump. But when you're a chump, then you have no money to pay for the permanent dividend.
You have no money to pay for schools, so Governor Dunleavy's first proposal was to fire 2,500 teachers across the state and educators. That's what a $250 million education cut does. That's 2,500 positions in schools where class sizes are already too big. You think we're giving kids too much education right now? You think we're doing too good? I mean, I think if you're
I think that our scores are always pretty low. You know,
if you're in last
the
place
the
in
bottom.
reading scores in fourth grade, you better take a deep look and say, I don't think we have the ability to cut 2,500 teachers and educators from our schools at this point. I mean, let's do something that creates opportunity for people regardless of whether you're born with wealth. I didn't grow up with wealth, and I know you want to talk about my story. I didn't grow up with wealth, but I was able to succeed. I cobbled together. I started working when I was 13. Yeah, that's on me, whatever. A lot of people do that. A lot of Alaskans have grown up without privilege and with tragedy, so I'm not special that way. But I get that I was able to succeed because I had a decent school, and yeah, I worked, and we'll talk more about it. But I also got my dad's veterans benefits because he was murdered when I was 6.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you about that because you've always been.
And I got financial aid, and I got scholarships because my grades are good, and all of that stuff. And I was able to I was always on the verge of dropping out of college, always on the verge of dropping out of law school because I almost didn't have enough money. But I got the help that I needed. We should have job training here that is affordable and aid for people who can't afford job training. And we should have college in a good college and aid so people who don't have the money can go to college. If you want to better yourself and you want to be an electrician, if you want to better yourself and be an auto mechanic, which we used to teach at the University of Alaska, you could get a certificate in auto mechanic. You could become a certificated auto mechanic at the University of Alaska. That's gone now. It was our biggest vocational education institution in the state. It still is. But the governor's hobbled it. Great. I'm glad he's well off. I'm glad his brother's a multimillionaire. I'm glad his brother was able to give him $700,000 for his last campaign to help buy that election.
I think it was a little less than that, but it was.
I'm glad that they're very well off and that they've succeeded. But you know what? I've succeeded too. That doesn't mean I turn my back on the people who are behind me.
I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, it's been in the news for a long time, and it's been talked about. And you've been an advocate for foster youth and the laptop program. You had a pretty tragic thing happen when you were a child with your father being murdered.
Yeah.
How old were you, and kind of what happened?
My dad was a hero. He had an office in Harlem in New York. It's the area he chose to have his office. And he loved his work. He was a family practice doc. And, my mom kidnapped me, took me away from the house when I was 3, and we lived on the run for 3 years.
Your parents were immigrants?
They were immigrants. They didn't get along, and my mom didn't get along with my older brother and sister, and so one day she just took me from the house. I understand her emotions about it. That's how she wanted one child. As a little kid, I wanted to be with my brother and sister. Mm-hmm. So for 3 years, we lived on the run. My father gets custody finally, and the court said she wasn't supposed to do what she did, and I understand all her emotions, and she moved to where her family was in Israel. My parents were immigrants they were born in Baghdad. Probably the lineages, burning of the Second Temple, Jews go to Babylonia, which becomes Iraq and Iran, mm-hmm. and my family was probably up there for, my descendants were probably there for 2,000 years. And then in the early 1950s, with the founding of Israel, the Arabs weren't thrilled about that. The Arab countries weren't thrilled about that. And the Arab countries where Jews had prospered and lived pretty well until then became very hostile. And my family's, all their property was taken, their money was taken, and my family evacuated from Baghdad. And many of my relatives went to Israel. My parents came to the United States. My father eventually started his doctor's office. When I was 6, my father finally got custody of me, and I was like happiness, right? I'm with my brother and my sister, and of me moving in and finally getting, my dream was to live with my brother and sister and my dad, and I wish they were all together, right? But that's where I wanted to be. So within 6 months of this moment that made me so happy, I got to move in with my brother and sister and dad. A knife-wielding guy, walked into his office, and where it's not well documented. We don't know who was killed first, but he killed with his knife every patient in that. How my father was killed, my brother protected me from it. He's 9 years older than me, and he told me my dad died in a car accident, but one day I had to
So your brother was 15 at the time?
He was 15, and I'll tell you a sad story about it. He had knife lacerations in his head, so everybody in that office was stabbed to death. Families across that neighborhood, grieved. And so I ended up growing up in foster care, and it's not a sad story. I had a pretty, among foster youth,
It sounds pretty sad.
My experience wasn't too bad, but.
Were you with one family?
I believe
were you raised?
No,
like that?
we weren't raised
Okay.
religious at all, and I have this belief in God, and I have a faith, but it's a faith that tells me also that there's a lot in the Gospels that I like, that you treat God the way you treat the least of thee, and I believe that. So
you were able to, in foster care, you were still able to obviously go to school, and you became a lawyer, went to law school.
Sure, public schools, really nice mixed race, lower middle class town on Long Island, right outside of New York City, and I just had one of my wrestling team buddies Facebook me, who I haven't heard from in 30 years, and it was really nice. But it reminded me it was a mixed race neighborhood. We were sort of colorblind in that town. Some of us were, right? Some were not. But it was, I grew up with mixed race friends, and
This is the 60s or 70s?
70s, and not that old, but getting there.
I'm aging you.
But the thing that I understand from my upbringing is that I'm not a self-made guy. I mean, I've succeeded, I got through school, and I was taught early on that if I had good grades, that was my only ticket out. And so I was like, I need this ticket out. And so I got good grades, played as many sports as I could, but I was like, I know I got to get good grades if I'm going to get a scholarship. And so I got into college with scholarship money, also financial aid, because I had no money, so I qualified for public help because I was not wealthy, and that's just become my ethic. If you don't grow up wealthy, that doesn't mean you should have no chance in the world. If you want to become an auto mechanic, or you want to become an electrician, or you want to go to college and you can't afford it, the answer shouldn't be that you can't succeed. The answer should be that there's somebody there to help you, just like there was somebody there to help me. I can't remember what combination of me working, starting when I was 13, or college financial aid, or my dad's veterans benefits that I got when I turned 18. What combination of that barely kept me in college, barely kept me in law school, but I was on the verge of dropping out constantly because I almost didn't have enough money, like 3 times a year to make it through.
How did you get to Alaska? Was it legal work? I know you were an attorney general at one point, assistant attorney.
Law students got that you apply to go work for a judge for a year. My second year of law school. Law school is 3 years. And so I was like, judge, what's that? And so by the time I caught wind of this whole, and I interviewed, and I got hired, and I came up to Fairbanks. People don't like lawyers, they don't like judges, but that man was a public servant. He worked 70 hours a week.
He's kind of a legend in the legal world up here in Alaska.
He's a legend, and his family, Annie, raised kids who are great, right? I mean, he started as a prosecutor, and people knew him that way. And back Attorney General Charlie Cole, they'd go to baseball games together. High sense of humor, and he looked at Tom Seaver, and he goes, that guy's got no arm. But anyway, so that's how I came up here. Then the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened, and I said as a lawyer I was going to do things that provided justice, or where I was on the right side. It was very important for me not to be on the wrong side as an attorney, and that's a hard thing to do, to try and stay on the right side. It ruined a lot of lives. People joke about how some people got rich off it. That's great, but it ruined a lot of lives. I called up the state and I said, are you going to hold them accountable? Ultimately, the Exxon folks on that, the team that was putting together the Exxon case said, well, they liked my resume, and was that we, in retrospect, were lucky to have settled it for about $1 billion in the first 2 years. But Exxon drug
Long time.
they drug them out
Decades,
for
right?
20 years.
Yeah.
Like people were dead by the time they got by the time their families got the money.
Ballot measure 2, the gubernatorial candidate chooses their running mate. They run as a team compared to before where it was the primaries, or if it was a petition independent, kind of, it was a different system. But you don't have a running mate just yet. You just filed. Do you have anybody in mind? Have you thought?
Country, oddly enough, but I would like the ticket to be diverse, and I would like it to be diverse ethnically, regionally, gender-wise. Now, am I going to be able to pull all that off? I don't know, but
it's hard for just one person to.
yeah, right. I can't find one person to be all those things, but there are people who've been very nice when I've talked. What I've learned in the early search, well, what I know is I'm not going to like rip through phone calls and treat people like they're fungible and interchangeable, like they're cogs in a wheel. I'm not going to. I just don't believe in disrespecting people like that. Like people are like, call these 10 people. I'm like, well, these 10 people are all individual human beings. I'm going to. So far, what I've learned is what I learned when I was helping recruit candidates to run for seats. Largely people who have non-political lives like those lives, and they're consent to give you names, but there are some amazing people out there, and
Oh yeah, one name or no?
I'm not gonna. I don't have the okay. I don't have their okay. I've had really good conversations with people across the state, and public office are already in public office or are already thinking about it, and most people would never ever run. And so a lot of the conversations have been, I got a 12-year-old, and I can support you, but I don't want to run.
What are your thoughts about the new system where you have to pick your running mate? Is that compared to the old system?
Look, I didn't vote for it because I thought it was confusing, but it's the law, and I'm going to respect it, right? And it sort of turns the conventional wisdom upside down, I think.
That's what I've been saying. There's this top 4. Even people are confused. I've tried to clarify. It's like when you get the primary ballot, you vote for one person or one ticket, and then the top 4 go on to the general. That's where it's ranked choice. But I think, and you talked a little bit about the top 4 before. It's like, who gets to the top 4? Is it 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats? Is it 3 Republicans and independent? Is it 3 Democrats? No one really knows how that's going to go, and that, I think, is going to have an impact on the results of any given race.
I've spent. I'll spend the energy to be in the top 4, and I'll spend the energy to win this election. But the fear we used to have is if 2 people from the same party run, they give the other party, they hand the game off to the other party because you split the vote.
Split, yeah.
But it's no longer that anymore. So what ranked choice voting does, it says the top 4 candidates in August, regardless of party, there's no primaries anymore, no closed primaries, and that's a good thing. I don't like closed primaries. But they go to the November election, and then you see who gets the most votes, but you also put down your second favorite candidate, right? And so if there are 3 people who legitimately believe that Mike Dunleavy is taking the state in the wrong direction, like not plant candidates. I've heard that Mike Dunleavy has some plant candidate that they want to come in 4th place, and then therefore his second place votes will go to Mike Dunleavy. So yeah,
I think everybody's been thinking about theoretically who is in the top 4 situation, who's the best person to finish last.
Right.
Where do their votes go? And then if nobody gets 51% after that, then the third place person, their votes get redistributed. So it becomes a whole other question of where do those votes go?
Right. So top 4, the person who comes in 4th place in November, they're out of it. They're disqualified, and then you look at who their second choice votes
unless someone
were.
gets 51% the first time.
Right. But probably not. So whoever comes in 4th place, their second place votes matter. Well, let's say, we all think we're going to come in 1st or 2nd place, but let's say, just hypothetically, Bill Walker comes in 4th place. I like Bill. I don't mean this is a slam against Bill. Let's say Bill Walker comes in 4th place. Who are his voters' second choice going to be? And I think his voters' second choice is going to be somebody who's going to replace Mike Dunleavy, because Bill and I have different views about how to move forward in this state. And I've got my own background, which I've talked to you about, which says that people deserve opportunity and a good paying job. And I believe in a living wage. Look, I'm a restaurant owner, and some of my co-owners, I'm a minority restaurant owner, so I don't, and I have to by law be a silent partner. I don't manage the place, but I believe in a living wage, and if you work hard, you should get paid for it. And I don't believe that if you work full time, you should get a poverty wage. That's my personal view, and so people have talked about a $15 minimum wage. I believe we can do a living wage, $15, maybe a little bit more. But you have to phase it in with increases in the minimum wage, but gradually as companies recover from COVID, right? You have to recognize the fact that this is a harmed economy right now. You can't. So you want to raise people's wages. The minimum wage is $10 an hour. That's a poverty wage for people who work full time. You got to be able to put food on your table. And I can't tell somebody that my business is more important than their food on the table. So that's part of what I believe in. It's just because of how I grew up. I know what it's like to have nothing. And I know that a lot of Alaskans have their own tragedy and their own struggle. And they know what it's like to have very little. And if you work full time, you shouldn't live in poverty. You shouldn't punish somebody who works full time. So I think we can afford it. I think COVID has shown you can afford it, because a lot of businesses are paying $12, $13, $14, $15 an hour. Not all of them, but that said they could never afford it before. And what it does for me as a restaurant owner is if you're a restaurant owner and you're paying your employees well, and the restaurant across the street is paying their employees half as much money, it actually puts you at a competitive advantage to make them pay their employees what you're paying.
Well, the COVID's created kind of an interesting scenario with these labor shortages, and then what people are offering bonuses. And Barbara Tuchman wrote that she said the first point in history where she thinks workers had real negotiating power was the plague, because so many people died.
Right.
So the workers in Europe all of a sudden said, well, we can still work for you, but
I don't think they were too wealthy during the plague. I don't think they were making $15 an hour.
No, but I'm saying the workers who were the kind of working for the landowners.
Yeah.
When so many people died, they all of a sudden had bargaining power. And I'm not saying this is the same thing, but there's less, there's a lot of labor shortages right now, and there's less people available to work for a lot of reasons. And now you see these businesses paying bonuses and higher wages. So it's I think there's a parallel there with kind of the market and how many people are.
Maybe my best understanding of the Middle Ages comes from Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Right.
So it didn't look that much fun to me back then, but
I think it was pretty bad. I think 2/3 of at some point, I think a third of Europe died. It was
right.
It was,
right. No, seriously, and yes. So I think the more important thing for people is that I think we now know that once businesses recover, we can pay these better wages than we were paying before. But I don't want them to disappear once COVID's over. I want COVID to be over fast, but I don't want these better wages to disappear when COVID's over. So I think a living minimum wage is important, and it's the soundbite is $15 an hour. I don't know if it's 15. I don't know if it's 16. Let's figure it out. Let's work with the business community. Let's phase it in a way that once businesses are recovering from COVID, hopefully it will be by the time I'm elected. We thought it was this summer, and then it wasn't the summer.
So I also wanted to ask you. You mentioned Bill Walker earlier. We mentioned he filed last week. You were in the legislature the whole time Bill Walker was governor. So you filed after he filed. I guess there's some disagreement, or are you? What about Bill? Because you guys did work together a little bit on some things.
Yeah, Bill and I legitimately like each other. We've had I used to bug him and say, "Hey, Bill, when are you gonna invite me over for a beer?" We get along well. I like Bill. I like the members of his family that I know. We just don't see eye to eye on everything, obviously, but I'm not here to drag Bill down. Bill's a nice guy. He's got his own vision. He gets to say what his vision is. I told you what my vision is, which is you take the low-hanging fruit, those 6,000 jobs that are good-paying jobs that would be right there, right now, if we just had the construction budget that we had in 2016 for the whole decade through 2016 before the budget crisis solved that nobody wanted to do anything about, except for 21 of us in the House. I think all you need to do, really, is at this point, the governor is governor for another year. I know he spent 3 years doing nothing about the budget deficit other than hiding from it. and spending the rest of our savings, and now saying he needs to take $3 billion extra out of the permanent fund to pay for government, he's got another year to solve the budget crisis. Maybe he'll miraculously wake up and solve the budget crisis before I'm governor. I don't think he will. I don't think he has it in him. I don't think he has the guts to stand up to the oil industry. You could get chump change out of the oil industry, and they'll say, "Oh, you twisted my arm really bad." But we need close to, depending on the price of oil, right? You can't overtax the oil company if oil's $20 a barrel, right? The whole idea is to keep them active and exploring. I mean, I want to sell our oil as long as there's a demand for it. I believe in doing something about climate change, and I have. But as long as there's a demand for oil, I'd rather the oil come out of Alaska than out of some country where they subjugate their women, right? I mean, so I know some people say, let's not sell our oil anymore, but that just gives these Saudi kings who treat women as third-class citizens more money. That's not my goal in the world. So as long as there's a demand for it, demand will dictate how long oil works, and we need to diversify this economy, and we need to do better on tourism than end tourism advertising funding that the tourism industry needed this year that the governor got rid of. I mean, we need to do better than slap our businesses and slap them around when they're struggling. And my last year as a legislator, Jason Grenn had a great bill. And I had always had a commitment to the tourism industry. If you chip in for tourism marketing, the state will be your partner. And for a long time, they just wanted the state to pay. And I get that. We had money. But I always said, if you chip in, we'll chip in. And they came to the table. And Jason Grenn had this great bill. Jason, former Republican, became an independent. And Jason's a great guy. He and I are good friends. You got to work across party lines, right? Jason's a good friend, and we had this alliance in the legislature of those people. We called it the sort of coalition of the people we could trust, and we were
a small group.
We were a small group, right? But there are Democrats and Republicans who I'd really want to get the car inspected before I bought a car from them, and so we had this coalition, and Jason was part of it, and a close friend, and Adam Wool was a good part of it. There were a bunch of people part of it. Tiffany Zolkowski. I mean, a bunch of people. I don't want to. If I leave out a name, you think they're not on it. But there were a bunch of good people. I'd say 40% of the legislators really, of both parties, worked really hard and cared about the future of the state. And I'd say a lot of people were like dead wood, and then a lot of people were just so partisan that they couldn't even let you pass good legislation. But on tourism, Jason had this great bill, and the tourism industry came along, and I was like, this works for me, and we're all saying we've got this partnership with the tourism industry to fund a tourism ad campaign, because that is a big part of this economy. And it provides jobs, it keeps businesses afloat, and it keeps Alaska afloat, and it keeps communities afloat so they can get the revenue that you get from tourism revenue for those small communities. And it's a good way to get people jobs. And the governor, stood against it. And so, I don't think we have a tourism marketing budget this year. If we do, it's meager.
Well, they did use some of the COVID money at some point to do some kind of tourism marketing. A couple $1 million, I guess.
You should run a state on the ground that you don't hope for a bailout from the federal government. If you get extra money from the feds, you can save your money for a year. But the governor, oddly enough, he likes taking his slaps at Biden and whatever. I understand people have political differences. When I'm governor, I don't care who's president. I'm going to try and get some money out of them, and so I'm not going to spit at them. The governor spits at them, and that's fine. But if we get any rescue, it's not going to be because Mike Dunleavy did anything. It's going to be because this massive COVID relief bill is going around the country, and it's going to bring some money to Alaska. But that's going to be temporary. So that does not solve the budget deficit. It solves it for a year and a half, maybe 2 years. And then the next governor is going to inherit this mess again. So, maybe he's playing the politics, which is the Biden money will get me through next year, and then I can go into the election saying everything's really good, and then I'll go back to who I was when I first got elected in 2018, and I'll cut schools by 25%, and I'll decimate the university again, and I'll decimate the Marine Highway for the people of Southeast, and I'll steal the money that goes to rural Alaska for power cost equalization to reduce electricity rates, which, you know, he talks about the dividend, which he really doesn't believe in, which he's never proposed a way to fund. It's been a false promise the whole time. I mean, come on. I'm not dumb. I mean, if you believe in something that you want to spend money on, come up with the revenue to pay for it. Don't just empty our savings account. Or what he's done is take an extra $3 billion out of the permanent fund. He's tried, the legislature hasn't let him, to raid the permanent fund by an extra $3 billion so that you rob the next generation of money that should be produced by permanent fund investments. That's not what you should be doing.
I think based on this first conversation for your campaign, it's going to be a very lively upcoming year, and I think more people are probably going to be getting in the race, so we'll be watching it, and we're looking forward to having more discussions and some debates here as the year goes on. But I want to thank you for coming in, Representative Gara, former Representative Gara, and talking with us, and I'm sure, like I said, it's going to be a lively year. So
yeah, a better future. You know, there's a brighter future ahead if we change our governors. There's a dim future ahead if we don't.
Let us know when you have a running mate. We'd like to know whenever
yeah,
that gets...
I'm working on it, but I'm not going to treat people disrespectfully and treat them like they're all just sort of pieces of a puzzle or cogs or inanimate objects. I'm going to speak to people, and I'm not going to say, hey, I got to call this other person if you don't get back to me by tomorrow. I'm not doing that. So
I hear you. Well, thanks again for coming in. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah.
Folks, thanks for tuning in, watching this episode of Landmine Live with former Representative Les Gara and current candidate for governor, running as Democrat. We'll be doing more of these. We actually invited Governor Dunleavy as well to come in. We had Governor Walker last week, and also we'll be getting Billy Toyin at some point, Libertarian, and then anybody else who files. So again, I want to thank Representative Gara for coming in, and I want to thank GCI, our main sponsor, for making videos like this possible. And stay tuned for our next interview. Thanks.